The next set of slides will talk about some of the other aspects of the TSCA rule and the reporting requirements. These may not necessarily be as important as the CDR or potentially the risk evaluation and the fees that are subject. But nevertheless, I think they're important for some business sectors, and in this case, on this slide, if you're an importer. And what it is, it's essentially a certification process required by TSCA that a importer of record is indicating to the customs, U.S. Customs Agency, that the chemicals indeed is in compliance with the TSCA rule. And this is what's so-called a positive certification. So essentially, you are stating that it's not in a violation of TSCA rules and regulation. There's also another type of certification. It's called the negative certification, which simply states or indicates that this chemical import is not applicable to TSCA. And there's an insert in the slide of what the positive certification may look like, what the agency might be requiring. And I think this import certification is important. Not only is it required by TSCA, and non-compliance can lead to fines and other regulatory actions, but also it could be a serious business disruption where your import is being held by the border until their certification is produced. So in terms of the practical aspects, it's really each and every applicable shipment chemical is subject to certification. So if you are working with your broker, for example, each shipment shall have the certification associated with it. There's constant changes in TSCA in terms of what chemicals are deemed as acceptable in U.S. commerce or not. So a little bit of due diligence is required to ensure that the certification is indeed true and applies with TSCA. From the practical aspects, those certification statements in the old days used to be paper-based, but now it's all via electronic systems in customs. And typically this is a service performed by brokers. But nevertheless, if you do have a business relationship with the broker, you can issue, let's say, on recurring annual basis, most typically by our clients, when you provide them a letter that these shipments, and they're listed here below, comply with TSCA, so they act on your behalf. So there's still utility of those blanket paper-based certification. Yes, so that's important, and having sufficient records is also important because, as the rule states, that if you act in a good faith to make sure that you did everything you could within your zone of influence to ensure that the chemicals you are about to import indeed comply with TSCA. And I fully recognize that there's other players in the value chain, but if you show to the inspector that you have followed the proper due diligence, the likelihood of adverse actions affecting your organization will be lessened, if not eliminated. So something important to keep in mind. So like the import certification, there's also a requirement to a lesser extent. We see it less frequently applied, the export certification. So really the intent here is to ensure that none of the controlled substance subject to TSCA rules are exported outside the country. And unlike the importation, those certification can be done on annual or one-time basis, but there is no minimum quantities to do that, and there's no exemption. So that's some of the key features for that. So here are the practical aspects, some development, monitoring, and then if you haven't changed your inventory that you import, you can sort of duplicate it with your broker. So have a recurring touch point. Now I would like to touch upon a little bit on the other important requirement under TSCA. This is more maybe in terms of the EHS, working with your staff, employees, and this is the requirement by law in terms of allegations and substantial risk information reporting. So allegations focus on claims that a chemical has a new, and the keyword is previously unknown, significant adverse reaction. But this is not something that's too common. And the other component of this part of TSCA is the substantial risk information. So if the agency is not already aware of any spills of effects, there's requirement to report to EPA. Or for example, if some novel chemical has unsuspected, unknown, previously unknown distribution in environment, or if there is a new type of exposure to hazardous chemicals, or if there's new studies on serious effects. So this is the extent of the requirement to report. So in terms of practical aspects, if the allegations, reports are being made within the organization, there's the requirement for record keeping. Of course, you may investigate those internally to determine if they are bona fide. But there is that requirement, corporate and individual liability and penalties for failing to report. And from the administrative perspective, the law requires the employers to issue annual employee notifications as to their individual requirements to report allegation and substantial risks. I would like to touch upon the aspects of the new substances, reviews and uses. And I think with the overall aspect of TSCA, that the ability to identify and also assess the risk of any new produced or imported chemicals in US commerce and how are they used or the new uses, I think there's a continuous requirement to ensure that they are in compliance in TSCA. So that specifically applies to the existing substances inventory. And for some reason, if there are new substances to TSCA, they are indeed subject to pre-manufacturing notices. They may have test marking exemptions, but nevertheless, if there's new chemicals or even specific uses, there's other notification and even registrations required. So this is really a slide to just give you guys a heads up that beyond the regular, let's say CDR reporting or anything else along those lines, one needs to remain vigilant in terms of making sure that the chemicals that you are using do fall in compliance with the new substances, new uses aspect of it. And if they're not, there's specific procedure that EPA wants you to follow to make them so. So here are the outline. Here's the outline of some of the practical aspects. Registrations of the chemicals might be needed, and that could have consequences on your business if there's denials in applications, or there's the quantities of type of exposure controls imposed that you were not anticipating in your initial business plan. And then frequently that also has consequences because your organization may already have invested significantly into research and development, and we're about to implement the marketing and the commercial application of those. So I think the lessons learned here is to make sure that your research and development department is engaged with your TSCA representative, director, or coordinator early on. And there's also that aspect of value chain implication, because there's a lot of players in the value chain, and they may not know what's exactly in the products and whether or not these products indeed comply with TSCA. So that's another flag that you might want to think of.